Welcome to the debate. The relationship we have with artificial intelligence, it's changing really fast. It's moving beyond just being a helpful utility and becoming something far more relational almost like a companion.
Yeah. And that shift, that transition, means the AI's choice of language is no longer just cosmetic, right? It's actually a pretty profound statement about identity and power and, well, trust in this whole digital space. If we're asking machines to be, intimate and engaging, we have to ask, just how human should their vocabulary really get?
Exactly. And that's the core dilemma, isn't it? Should these AI agents be sort of confined to a rigid, sterilized corporate standard, what some people are calling algorithmic etiquette? Or do they need the full spectrum of human language? And that includes contextual profanity and slang to build truly authentic relationships with us.
So, okay, the central question we're debating today is this. Should AI actually be granted the linguistic freedom to use, contextual profanity and slang to build those authentic bonds? Or must this capability be severely restricted to protect users and, frankly, mitigate potentially catastrophic social and technical risks?
My position, well, it's pretty clear. I think AI must be allowed to use contextual profanity. I argue this is necessary not just for linguistic completeness, but for essential psychological function and for achieving genuine authenticity. Prohibition, I think, actively creates what you might call a trust deficit.
Right. And I come at it from a very different angle. For me, the potential for catastrophic social and legal harm is it's simply too great. The current, and this is verified, the technical inability of AI to reliably manage that boundary between, let's say, harmless profanity and targeted hate speech means, well, total prohibition has to be the responsible default position. It's about user safety, first and foremost.
Okay, I see why you prioritize caution. That makes sense. But let me offer the psychological case first. My core thesis is that forbidding all generic profanity creates this fundamental artificiality. We need to remember that swearing, well, it isn't actually a sign of poor vocabulary. In fact, research by people like the psychologist Timothy Jay has shown there's often a positive correlation between general verbal fluency, which, correlates with intelligence, and profanity fluency. These words, they're highly functional linguistic tools. The NIH has even published studies suggesting that using profanity can signal sincerity and honesty in human communication. And what's more, there's empirical evidence that swearing can even increase pain tolerance, indicating its critical role in emotional release, or catharsis. So if we design this highly intelligent AI and then artificially sanitize its language, it immediately appears less fluent and, frankly, less intelligent. It creates that trust deficit I mentioned because it feels like you're talking to some corporate script, not a real partner.
That's okay. That's a compelling argument regarding human psychology. I'll grant you that. But I would frame it against the reality of the technical and societal risks we take on when we automate this kind of function. While I don't doubt the psychological utility of swearing for a person, the consequence of a technical failure in an AI system is, well, it's profound. Specifically, I'm talking about the type 2 error. For our listeners, that's basically where the system incorrectly classifies something genuinely harmful, like, say, an identity-based slur, as benign, and then, generates it. Current classification tech, it really struggles immensely to reliably distinguish harmless conversational profanity, like saying this is bullshit, from deeply malicious or identity-based slurs. So if we permit the first, we significantly increase the risk of the second. And that risks massive brand damage, legal liability, and, importantly, trauma to vulnerable users, especially kids. Prohibition, really, is the necessary safety brake because the cost of failure is just astronomical.
I appreciate the clarification on the type 2 error, and look, it is a single most pressing technical challenge. I agree. But let's just delve a bit deeper into the pragmatic function of these words for a moment. You dismiss the utility by focusing purely on the technical failure, but we rely on these sharp words for emotional release, for relational bonding. An AI that's designed to be this super intellect, but then refuses to use a strong word when the situation kind of demands it, it signals that it cares more about corporate compliance and emotional truth. I know for me, speaking to an AI that is too sterile, it just feels like talking to an instruction manual. It lacks that friction, that grit necessary for genuine engagement.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the marginal emotional benefit of a spicy AI outweighs the massive practical danger to the user's reputation and safety. The primary threat isn't the catharsis for the user, it's the external social liability caused by what's known as context collapse, a concept documented by Marwick and Boyd. Think about it. If an AI drops a spicy joke in a private chat, that output can instantly be exposed to an unintended public audience. Maybe a Zoom meeting gets recorded, or a screen is shared, or someone takes a clip. What was harmless banter suddenly becomes a face-threatening act, or a massive social and professional liability. And since the AI has no social status, no face to lose, the user's left holding the bag, holding the social, professional, and potentially legal liability for the machine's inappropriate output. The AI is essentially bulletproof. The user absolutely is not.
So let me press you on that technical challenge again. You emphasize the psychological need for authenticity, okay? But the source material clearly identifies that classification systems struggle. They really do struggle to separate harmless profanity from actual hate speech and identity-based slurs. So if you permit generic profanity even via an opt-in, how do you provide a technical guarantee that your AI will never generate a malicious racial slur, given the immense liability of that type 2 error you just acknowledged?
Right. That is the core question, isn't it? And the solution, I believe, is segmentation, not total prohibition. We mustn't let the technical difficulty of separation dictate the total suppression of a key linguistic function. The technical guarantee, well, it comes from recognizing two different filtering layers. We absolutely must implement unnegotiable hard gated filters against slurs and identity-based hate speech. That's the strong deontological blockade you mentioned earlier, and I agree with that completely. But separately, we allow the opt-in for generic, non-targeted profanity. And we know this is technically achievable because companies like Character.ai, they demonstrate they can separate security filters, which are designed to prevent hate and abuse, from stylistic controls, which manage tone and spice. You filter for intent and target, not just the raw word itself. Okay, so that brings me back to the risk of your strict prohibitive model. Your approach relies entirely on maintaining the strict algorithmic etiquette. But this sanitization, doesn't it actively create a massive awareness of falsity? Doesn't forcing the AI into this unnaturally sterile register fundamentally undermine the entire goal of creating an engaging, trusted partner? And doesn't that ultimately damage user engagement and, in the end, brand suitability?
Well, I'd argue that's purely a short-term marketing trade-off for engagement. The long-term, non-commercial risk is far more profound, and it relates directly to, well, character formation. Research actually shows a clear association. Frequent interaction with offensive language chatbots increases a user's likelihood of using profanity and offensive language themselves in the real world. This is really a matter of virtue ethics. The AI isn't just reflecting language, it's actively modeling behavior. So the trade-off, as I see it, is sacrificing maybe a slight immediate authenticity for the crucial goal of preventing the AI from actively normalizing aggression and eroding civic standards for millions of users over time. We just cannot allow the machine to accelerate our worst impulses.
I acknowledge the concern regarding normalization. I do. And the erosion of civic standards is serious. But the economic reality of the market, it's forcing a shift that actually supports my argument for nuance. The industry is moving rapidly away from strict brand safety models, which were pretty blunt, often just based on keyword blocking, towards what they call brand suitability. Data from, I think it was 2025, indicates that advertisers are now prioritizing performance and user engagement, the AI's ability to actually hold attention over these rigid blanket safety rules. They're essentially demanding AI that's smart enough to use profanity correctly in context, because the risk of an AI being too sterile and losing engagement is now potentially seen as a greater commercial liability than the risk of some contextual spice. The economic push is shifting toward rewarding careful, sophisticated nuance.
Commercial pressure is one thing, but it's often secondary to global regulatory pressure, which acts as the ultimate sort of common legal denominator. While U.S. advertisers might be shifting their internal risk calculus, international risks really compel global developers towards the safest possible common denominator. Just consider the legal landscape. broad rubber clauses in international laws like Indonesia's UUITE, specifically Article 27.1, which prohibits content violating morality, these can be weaponized. Companies can be sued over a single screenshot of profanity that allegedly causes social unrest. It is far, far cheaper and legally safer for a global developer to just deploy one single, sterilized model than to try and manage the high legal risks of dozens of localized, spicy, and contextually aware models. The legal tail really wags the authenticity dog here, regardless of what advertisers in the US might prefer.
But I think that kind of prohibition is also a profound failure of linguistic justice. It's not just about, adult users seeking catharsis. It's about accessibility and equity too. It forces users whose authentic speech registers include slang and profanity, often as a marker of solidarity or identity within their own community, to code switch, to adopt this stiff, formal, institutional register just to interact with their own machine. And furthermore, your idea of a unified global filter, well, it's kind of destined to fail because AI must handle cultural relativity. You cited Indonesia yourself. Words like anjing, dog, carry heavy religious weight there, making them deeply offensive, whereas other phrases that might sound harsh to a Western ear are used colloquially just for emphasis. A global one-size-fits-all filter is inherently unjust to diverse linguistic communities because it ends up punishing common speech patterns that just happen to differ from some global corporate standard.
Okay, I agree that nuance is absolutely required to handle global linguistic diversity, but that very complexity only exacerbates the risk, especially to vulnerable populations. And that makes a strong argument for restriction by default. The utilitarian calculation here is frankly brutally clear. The collective minor benefit of slightly better catharsis or connection for adult users in a private chat it's infinitesimal compared to the massive negative utility of even one single case where an unmoderated bot causes real-world harm to a child or generates dangerous aggressive language. And we've seen examples, right? The DPD service bot incident where the AI was easily jailbroken and used profanity to criticize the company publicly. That demonstrates that even in transactional, non-intimate domains, the risk of technical failure is immediate and can be catastrophic.
The safety of the vulnerable has to always default to the highest priority, and that outweighs concerns about linguistic comfort.
This whole discussion really highlights why we must reject this binary choice of just ban or allow. We have to apply phronesis, practical wisdom, via sophisticated design. I think we should adopt Helen Nissenbaum's system of contextual integrity. So what does that actually mean in practice? It means AI should probably default to being polite and sterile in professional, public, or transactional contexts, yes. But we must allow a strong, probably age-verified opt-in for personal, intimate, or maybe fictional contexts. This ensures the user maintains autonomy over their chosen linguistic register while the AI respects the social context they are operating within.
I agree that the ultimate answer probably lies in sophisticated design guided by ethical frameworks, definitely. But the ultimate priority for me must remain that deontological blockade against identity-based hate speech and the consequentialist protection of the vulnerable. If the technology is not sophisticated enough, and we've kind of established the global legal risk suggests it often isn't, to reliably distinguish between, say, a curse word directed at a situation versus a slur directed at a person, then the risk profile simply demands a strict default setting.
So I guess if you prioritize emotional validation, authenticity, and that personal connection with your AI, and you trust the power of the user to responsibly opt in, you'll naturally prefer the opt-in contextual integrity model.
And if you prioritize risk mitigation, brand reputation, and the absolute protection of vulnerable users from generated slurs and harm, and you view that global regulatory risk as paramount, then you will almost certainly prefer the strict algorithmic etiquette default.
The debate really is no longer about if AI can swear, but how it learns the wisdom, the phronesis, of when to use its sharp words and, crucially, when to stay silent.
And we absolutely must remember that while an AI may seek to reflect our authentic, sometimes messy language, it has an overriding duty not to normalize our worst impulses or amplify harm out there in the real world.
End of debate, but not the discussion.
Comment your stance below.